When empires stop feeding others, they're preparing to starve themselves. In 1980, the Soviet Union was the world's second-largest wheat exporter. Their grain flowed across Eastern Europe, supported allied nations, and demonstrated agricultural abundance that validated communist economic theory. Soviet leaders spoke proudly of feeding both their people and their ideological partners. Food exports represented power projection through agricultural surplus, proof that their system could produce enough to share with the world. By 1985, the Soviet Union had banned grain exports entirely, not because of drought or crop failure, but because of something far more ominous. They had recognized mathematical reality that their leadership couldn't publicly acknowledge. Their system was consuming more resources than it could produce. Food exports had become impossible because food security had become precarious. They were hoarding grain not from abundance, but from scarcity, from fear, from the desperate recognition that their empire was entering its terminal phase. This pattern isn't unique to the Soviet Union. It's universal. Throughout history, every major empire has followed the same sequence during decline. First, they export agricultural surplus as demonstration of strength. Then, they restrict exports as demonstration of caution. Finally, they ban exports completely as demonstration of panic. Food nationalism always signals the transition from empire confidence to empire siege mentality. Today, over 40 countries have implemented food export restrictions since 2020, not because of global food shortages, but because each nation has recognized the same mathematical reality that gripped Soviet leadership in 1985. Their domestic systems are consuming more than they're producing. Their currencies are losing purchasing power. Their political stability depends on maintaining food security, even at the cost of international relationships. Food export bans represent the most reliable predictor of systemic collapse, because food security reveals truth that financial markets can obscure. Currency manipulation can disguise monetary problems. Statistical reporting can hide economic weakness. Diplomatic language can camouflage political instability. But food distribution exposes actual productive capacity versus actual consumption needs. When nations stop sharing food, they're acknowledging that their systems have entered scarcity mode. The Soviet Union's grain export ban represented far more than agricultural policy adjustment. It marked the moment when communist leadership privately admitted their economic model couldn't generate sufficient surplus to support external commitments. Every ton of wheat exported was a ton unavailable for domestic consumption. Every shipment to Cuba or Vietnam was resources subtracted from Soviet citizens. When the mathematics no longer worked, exports stopped immediately. Soviet agricultural statistics had been manipulated for decades to support political narratives about communist productivity. Official reports showed consistent increases in grain production, dairy output, and meat availability. Western intelligence agencies knew these statistics were inflated, but the extent of manipulation only became apparent when export bans revealed actual scarcity levels. The mathematical reality was brutal. Soviet agricultural production had peaked in the 1960s and declined steadily throughout the 1970s. Population growth, urbanization, and industrial expansion created increasing food demand, while collective farming policies reduced agricultural efficiency. By 1980, domestic consumption requirements exceeded domestic production by margins that made export commitments impossible to sustain. Soviet leadership faced the choice that every declining power eventually confronts: honor international food commitments and risk domestic food shortages that could trigger political instability, or abandon international obligations to preserve domestic stability while acknowledging systemic failure to produce sufficient surplus. They chose domestic preservation, implementing export bans that signaled terminal economic weakness to anyone who understood the implications. The speed of this transition revealed the severity of underlying problems. Nations with genuine agricultural abundance don't suddenly ban exports. Systems producing actual surpluses don't immediately shift to hoarding behavior. The Soviet export ban represented panicked response to mathematical realities that had been building for years, but couldn't be publicly acknowledged until crisis forced policy changes. What makes food export bans particularly significant as collapse predictors is their relationship to political legitimacy. Governments derive authority from their ability to provide basic necessities for their populations. When food security becomes questionable, political stability becomes precarious. Export bans represent government admission that they cannot simultaneously feed their people and honor international commitments. This creates feedback loops that accelerate systemic breakdown. Export bans signal weakness to international observers, reducing confidence in the nation's economic stability. Reduced confidence affects currency values, making food imports more expensive. Higher import costs increase domestic food prices, creating political pressure for additional protectionist measures. Each protective action validates the logic behind other nations' similar policies. Argentina provides another clear demonstration of this pattern. During the 2000s, Argentina was a major beef exporter, shipping high-quality meat to markets worldwide. Argentine leaders spoke proudly of feeding global populations while maintaining strong domestic consumption levels. Beef exports represented agricultural abundance that supported both economic growth and political stability. By 2006, Argentina had implemented beef export quotas. By 2009, export taxes reached 35% on beef shipments. By 2021, Argentina banned beef exports entirely for several months. Each restriction represented governmental recognition that domestic food costs were becoming politically unsustainable. Export bans became necessary to maintain domestic consumption levels at politically acceptable prices. The Argentine pattern followed mathematical progression identical to Soviet grain policy. Initial abundance enabled generous export policies. Growing domestic demand combined with currency devaluation made exports economically attractive but politically problematic. Export earnings supported government revenues while domestic prices rose beyond acceptable levels. Eventually, political pressure forced export restrictions that prioritized domestic consumption over international commitments. Argentina's beef export bans coincided with broader economic instability that included currency crises, debt restructuring, and political upheaval. Food nationalism wasn't the cause of Argentine economic problems, but it was the most reliable predictor of systemic breakdown. When nations prioritize food hoarding over food sharing, they're acknowledging that their economic models have entered failure modes. Indonesia's palm oil export ban in 2022 followed identical logic. Indonesia produces over half the world's palm oil, and export revenues had supported economic growth for decades. Palm oil shipments generated foreign currency earnings that helped stabilize Indonesia's trade balance and currency values. Domestic consumption was adequately supplied while export earnings supported broader economic stability. But currency devaluation and domestic inflation made palm oil exports economically attractive while politically problematic. International prices for palm oil reached levels that made domestic cooking oil unaffordable for Indonesian consumers. Political pressure mounted as food costs became election issues. The government faced the same choice that confronted Soviet wheat policy and Argentine beef policy. Honor export commitments or preserve domestic political stability. Indonesia chose domestic preservation, implementing a complete palm oil export ban that shocked international markets. The ban lasted only a month before partial relaxation, but the signal was clear. Indonesian leadership had demonstrated willingness to abandon international commitments when domestic political pressure required protectionist responses. Food nationalism had replaced export-oriented policies. The psychological transition represented by food export bans is particularly significant because it marks the moment when national leadership shifts from growth-oriented thinking to survival-oriented thinking. Nations implementing food export bans are acknowledging, usually unconsciously, that their systems have entered decline phases, where resource preservation becomes more important than resource optimization. During growth phases, nations export agricultural surplus because they recognize that specialization and trade create wealth more efficiently than autarky. Food exports generate foreign currency that can purchase manufactured goods, technology, and services more efficiently than domestic production. Export-oriented policies reflect confidence in the system's ability to generate surplus and adapt to changing conditions. During decline phases, nations ban food exports because they recognize that their systems can no longer generate reliable surplus. Political stability depends on maintaining domestic consumption levels, even if this requires abandoning international efficiency. Food nationalism reflects fear that the system cannot adapt to changing conditions without risking political legitimacy through food insecurity. This psychological transition from confidence to fear typically occurs years before financial markets or political analysts recognize systemic problems. Food export policies reveal governmental thinking about long-term sustainability in ways that diplomatic statements or economic statistics cannot. When nations choose food hoarding over food optimization, they're privately acknowledging systemic weakness. India's rice export ban in 2023 demonstrated this pattern with particular clarity. India had been the world's largest rice exporter, with shipments supporting food security across Asia and Africa. Indian rice exports represented agricultural abundance that generated foreign currency earnings while demonstrating India's emergence as a global economic power. But monsoon disruption combined with currency pressures to create domestic political pressure around rice availability and pricing. Indian leadership recognized that continued rice exports could compromise domestic food security during periods of agricultural uncertainty. The choice became clear: maintain export revenues and risk domestic food shortages, or preserve domestic consumption and abandon export commitments. India chose domestic preservation, implementing rice export bans that disrupted global food markets and increased prices for rice-dependent populations worldwide. The ban represented Indian acknowledgement that their agricultural system couldn't reliably produce surplus sufficient to meet both domestic and international obligations during periods of uncertainty. The speed and completeness of India's export ban revealed the severity of concerns about domestic food security. Nations with genuine agricultural abundance don't typically implement comprehensive export bans in response to modest production uncertainties. The policy represented panicked response to mathematical realities about production versus consumption that had become politically unmanageable. Turkey's grain export restrictions followed similar logic throughout 2022 and 2023. Turkey had historically been a significant wheat exporter, with grain shipments generating foreign currency earnings that supported broader economic stability. But currency devaluation combined with domestic inflation to make grain exports economically attractive while politically problematic. Turkish citizens faced bread prices that increased faster than wages, creating political pressure for government intervention in grain markets. Export earnings helped support Turkey's currency and trade balance, but domestic bread costs became election issues. The government implemented export licensing requirements and quotas that effectively banned grain exports during critical periods. Turkish grain policy revealed the mathematical impossibility of simultaneously maintaining export revenues and domestic price stability when currency devaluation makes exports profitable while imports become expensive. Food nationalism became necessary to preserve political legitimacy, even though export restrictions damaged Turkey's international economic relationships. The global proliferation of food export bans since 2020 represents collective recognition of mathematical realities that individual governments cannot publicly acknowledge. Over 40 countries have implemented some form of food export restriction, creating a global shift toward food nationalism that mirrors the protectionist policies that characterized the 1930s during the last major economic crisis. Each nation implementing food export restrictions believes their situation is unique and temporary. Soviet leaders thought grain export bans would last only until domestic production recovered. Argentine officials expected beef export restrictions to be short-term responses to currency fluctuations. Indonesian authorities assumed palm oil bans would quickly resolve domestic pricing problems. But food export bans, once implemented, tend to become permanent because they address symptoms rather than causes. The underlying mathematical problems that make food exports politically difficult don't resolve through export restrictions. Currency weakness, domestic inflation, agricultural inefficiency, and political instability typically worsen after export bans because the bans themselves signal systemic weakness to international observers. This creates feedback loops that make export ban policies self-reinforcing. Export bans reduce confidence in the nation's economic stability. Reduced confidence affects currency values and borrowing costs. Currency weakness makes imports more expensive, increasing domestic inflation. Higher inflation creates additional political pressure for protectionist policies. Each restriction validates the logic behind additional restrictions. The mathematical progression becomes irreversible because food export bans represent acknowledgement of scarcity rather than policy choices about abundance. Nations don't ban food exports when they have genuine surplus. They ban exports when they recognize surplus has disappeared. The policy reveals mathematical realities about production versus consumption that cannot be resolved through trade restrictions. Modern communication technology accelerates this process by making food export bans immediately visible to global markets. When Indonesia banned palm oil exports, international prices spiked within hours. When India restricted rice exports, Asian food markets adjusted immediately. When Russia limited grain shipments, African nations faced food security crises within weeks. This immediate global impact creates pressure for additional nations to implement preemptive export restrictions. If major food exporters are banning shipments, other nations must secure food supplies before scarcity spreads. Food nationalism becomes contagious as each export ban validates the logic behind other nations' similar policies. The current wave of food export bans differs from historical examples primarily in scope and coordination. Previous food nationalist policies typically affected individual nations during specific crises. The 1930s saw widespread trade restrictions, but food export bans were often temporary responses to particular economic pressures. Today's food export restrictions are occurring simultaneously across dozens of nations representing different economic systems, political structures, and agricultural sectors. Rice exporters, wheat producers, cooking oil suppliers, meat exporters, and fertilizer manufacturers are all implementing restrictions that prioritize domestic consumption over international commitments. This synchronization suggests underlying problems that transcend individual national circumstances. When dozens of countries simultaneously shift from food sharing to food hoarding, they're responding to global systemic pressures rather than local agricultural problems. The collective movement toward food nationalism indicates recognition of scarcity that goes beyond temporary production difficulties. The mathematical reality driving this collective behavior is currency debasement across all major economies. When central banks expand money supplies simultaneously, currency values decline relative to real goods, including food. Export restrictions become necessary to prevent domestic food prices from rising to politically unacceptable levels while maintaining export earnings in devaluing currencies. Food export bans represent governmental recognition that monetary policy has created impossible mathematics. Nations cannot simultaneously maintain currency stability, export earnings, and domestic food affordability when currency creation exceeds productive capacity. Something must give, and governments consistently choose domestic political stability over international economic commitments. The historical pattern suggests this represents early stages of broader systemic breakdown. Food nationalism typically precedes trade wars, currency crises, and political instability by several years. Nations that begin with food export restrictions usually progress to broader protectionist policies as underlying mathematical problems worsen. Soviet grain export bans preceded comprehensive trade restrictions that isolated the Soviet economy from global markets. Argentine food export policies preceded broader economic nationalism that included currency controls and import restrictions. Indonesian palm oil bans preceded broader protectionist measures affecting multiple economic sectors. The progression from food nationalism to comprehensive economic nationalism occurs because food export bans address symptoms of systemic problems rather than causes. Currency weakness, fiscal imbalances, agricultural inefficiency, and political instability typically worsen after export restrictions because the restrictions signal weakness, while failing to resolve underlying mathematical realities. Understanding food export bans as early warning indicators requires recognizing their relationship to longer-term systematic breakdown. Nations don't implement food restrictions during periods of confidence and growth. They implement restrictions during periods of fear and decline. The policy reveals governmental thinking about systemic sustainability in ways that other indicators cannot. When nations choose food hoarding over food optimization, they're acknowledging that their systems have entered scarcity phases where survival becomes more important than efficiency. This psychological transition from growth-oriented policies to survival-oriented policies typically occurs years before financial collapse becomes apparent through conventional economic indicators. Food export bans signal the beginning of the end because they represent governmental admission that domestic systems cannot generate reliable surplus. When empires stop sharing food with others, they're revealing mathematical realities about production versus consumption that make continued growth impossible. The transition to food nationalism marks the point where decline becomes inevitable because the underlying mathematics cannot be resolved through policy adjustment. The pattern is absolute, the progression is predictable, and the outcome is determined by mathematical laws that operate independently of political preferences. When empires enter terminal phases, they always choose food preservation over food sharing. They always prioritize domestic consumption over international commitments. They always implement export restrictions that signal systemic weakness to anyone who understands historical precedent. Today's global wave of food export bans follows this historical pattern with mathematical precision. Over 40 nations have simultaneously recognized that their systems cannot generate surplus sufficient to meet both domestic and international obligations. They are preparing for scarcity, not managing abundance. They are hoarding resources, not optimizing distribution. They are acknowledging mathematical realities that their public statements cannot admit. When empires stop feeding others, the end has already begun. Food export bans don't cause systemic collapse, but they reveal that collapse has become mathematically inevitable. The progression toward breakdown accelerates once food nationalism replaces food sharing because the underlying problems that drive export restrictions cannot be solved through protectionist policies. Food export bans always signal the beginning of the end because they mark the moment when mathematical reality overcomes political narrative. When nations can no longer afford to share food with others, they can no longer afford the illusion that their systems are sustainable. The transition to food nationalism represents acknowledgement of decline that typically precedes broader systemic breakdown by years, not decades.